Welcome to What the Catholic Church Teaches. I'm your host, Julius Smetona. This is the second of two programs dealing with liberalism. Last week, we laid the philosophical basis. This week, we're going to talk about the impacts in the 20th century, separation of church and state, freedom of the press, a woman's right to her own body. With us again is Father William Jenkins, formerly professor of philosophy at St. Thomas Aquinas Seminary. Father Jenkins, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Julius. It's good to be here.
Father Jenkins, we left off last week talking about church and state. What is the relationship, according to the Catholic view, that should take place between church and state?
The church and state are supposed to work together in harmony. They are not supposed to be rivals. There is a certain amount of difficulty involved in the fact that they have as their subjects the same people. And the state governs the same people who are members of the church. That is why it is so important for the two of them to work together.
What role should the state have in regards to recognizing any particular religion? For instance, in our society today, there's a tremendous clamor if it's viewed that the state might favor any particular religion. And if I'm correct, I don't believe any Western country recognizes any religion as being the religion. Should this be the case?
Should it be the case that no country recognizes?
In other words, that the state should not recognize one religion in favor of another because all religions have certain equal rights. This would be a form of oppression. Should this be the case?
No, it should not be the case. In fact, Catholic doctrine, and defined Catholic doctrine, is that the state has an obligation to recognize the true God and to worship him in the true religion. That sounds like a terrible thing to say. In terms of liberalism, that would be considered a heresy. But for us who believe that there is a God who has revealed himself to us in the person of our Lord Jesus Christ, knowing that God is not only the God of the church, but the God of all mankind in all aspects of human life, and that means when it comes to society and government. Government also, as a human institution, has an obligation to recognize the true God and worship him in the true religion.
What impact would this have? For instance, in our society, it said Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion. And in general, wouldn't this lead to oppression of other religious groups, that suddenly their tax money would have to support something they disagree with?
Well, you have to understand that this passage is interpreted in various ways. As a matter of fact, the original meaning of this passage, Congress shall make no law, was a limitation on the powers of Congress. It was a limitation that was put into effect to sort of put at ease the fear of the states that the National Congress would impose a religion upon them. There is nothing in the United States Constitution or the Bill of Rights which would actually prevent an individual state.
Now you're saying this,
and in fact, originally some of the states did have state religions.
You're saying that this idea of the ideal, in fact, is when the state actually recognizes the Catholic Church is what the Church has held up. It seems this isn't what Vatican II taught. In fact, Vatican II seems to imply that the ideal state of affairs is where no religion is recognized as being the true religion.
That is the teaching of Vatican II. The last document of that council, Dignitatis Humanae Personae, teaches that it is not only right reason, but it is actually the teaching of the gospel that the state must treat all religions indifferently and regard them all on an equal footing before the law. This was condemned as a heresy by Pope Pius IX. He said it was contrary to the teaching of the Scriptures, contrary to the teaching of the Fathers of the Church, and contrary to the teaching of the magisterium of the Church itself.
Let alone non-Catholics, how are Catholics supposed to relate to this dichotomy? Here we have a previous pope who's been dead for many, many years saying one thing, and now the vibrant living church seems to be saying something else. What are we to take of this?
We are to think that this cannot be. There's something wrong somewhere. Even one of the theological experts at Vatican II, Yves Congar, a Dominican priest, said there was a direct contradiction between the teaching of Vatican II and this document on religious liberty and the teaching of Pope Pius IX in an infallible document. Now, as far as this doctrine that the church and the state must not be enemies, must not ignore each other, but actually should cooperate together, this doctrine is one that is rather frightening to some people. Because when Catholics start talking like this, they begin to think, well, we're training armed revolutionaries to take over the country and to make it a Catholic nation. That's not so. That's not so at all. The point is that there's no intention whatsoever of using any force to pursue this doctrine of the Church. But the Church is trying to make her Catholic children understand that they cannot simply rest with things the way they are. They should want, if they believe that all of their fellow countrymen have souls, and that they are all redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ, they should want nothing more than that they recognize that fact, that they all save their souls, and they work for this. We can't simply accept the situation as though it were the ideal. It may be the best situation under the circumstances, but what we really want is for everyone to recognize our Lord Jesus Christ as being the King of the universe. We want all to obey him, honor him, and eventually the entire country to recognize him.
You characterized liberalism, Father, as in our previous program, as an idea which distrusted government, which wanted to limit the powers of government, which thought that government was an unnatural institution. And yet, it seems precisely today that the liberals are the ones who want to use the power of government to achieve certain social ends, and that is the conservatives who view with alarm this encroaching government power. How do you reconcile this? Because it seems this does not correspond to your definition.
Definition of what?
Of liberalism, or your characterization of liberalism, at least in the 19th and 18th centuries.
Well, last century's liberals were those who wanted the government to stay out of everything and just let things go the way they would. They didn't want the government to interfere in anything, even terrible evils that came about from the Industrial Revolution. Now, 20th century liberals are the ones who are pushing for more and more government control, more and more government influence. This gets back to what we said last week about how liberalism necessarily leads to collectivism and tyranny, where the government absorbs everything, every function.
Could you please explain that again? This again seems to be very paradoxical, that something which advocates total freedom leads, in fact, to tyranny. In fact, I can recall that Pope Pius XI, in his encyclical Atheistic Communism, said, in fact, that liberal economics leads to communism. This always struck me as being very strange.
It's not strange at all, actually. One extreme often does result in the other extreme. This is true in the religious sphere also. In fact, we look at our own capitalist society. It appears that there is in the world today a great conflict between capitalism and socialism, or the economic system we have in this country and the economic system in the Soviet countries. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with capitalism. Capitalism as a system is actually something that is good. Socialism is intrinsically evil, because it denies to man God-given rights, the right to property. But when you take capitalism, which is in itself good, and you divorce it from any moral law so that it's not restrained by anything, it simply becomes ruthless. It's whoever can lie the best and most convincingly, whoever can be the most ruthless and disregard the most laws, get the upper hand, he wins. Now that kind of unrestrained competition is not really capitalism. I suppose in former days they would call it mercantilism or laissez-faire capitalism. Well, this is what the liberals of the last century were actually standing for.
Who were some of these liberal economists of the 19th and even 18th centuries who advocated this position?
Well, John Stuart Mill, for one.
What about Adam Smith? Would you characterize him as being a liberal?
I would characterize him as being a liberal, too.
What was their view of economics?
To answer your question is that, with a somewhat lengthy and convoluted answer, is that in this country, when we come to a system of capitalism which is not restrained by the moral law of God, then the ones who gain the upper hand, who have the money, have the power, and they can use that power to influence government or even to control government. Now, when you have the people who control the means of production also running the government, what have you got?
Well, you have a very bad state of affairs. You have a concentration of power.
You have socialism. But it can come about as a result of unbridled competition with, which does not know restraint of any moral law.
It seems that there's a concept called social Darwinism in the 19th century, and some of the advocates were, for instance, Herbert Spencer. And they said, just as in the biological order we have a certain natural selection, a survival of the fittest, we must have this in the economic order as well, that if we want to have progress, some people are going to get hurt. What's your view on this?
Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible. Again, it does not take into consideration the existence of God, the existence of the human soul in God's image and likeness. It considers the individual not as a person, but as a thing. And he exists to serve the society. He exists to serve the collectivity. By the way, something that's important for us to understand when it comes to the Catholic notion of how a society should be structured, and this is something that is at the very bedrock of our American understanding of government, what Catholic Church calls the principle of subsidiarity, or the principle of subsidiary function. And that is that the lower or more elemental part of any society has rights, and the higher element, as you move up through the ranks of government to the very highest rank of government, each one of those successive ranks exists to serve the lower. That is, to help the lower realize what is its destiny given to it by God. The individual is destined to become a good moral person and to save his soul. Government is meant to help him do that. The family, which is the bedrock, the fundamental unit of society, has rights of its own that are given to it directly by God, not by the government. When the government goes in and tries to usurp those rights, it is wrong. The government exists actually to help the family fulfill its rights and duties before God. This is the principle of subsidiary function. When the government tries to remove itself from the auxiliary function it has, which is that of a helper, and decides to become the dictator and to take over the rights, that's when it's very wrong.
You mentioned about rights and government protecting these rights. Can government ever grant any rights? Are there any rights which a government can grant to its citizens?
A government can grant secondary rights, I'd say, but the government exists to enable human beings, its citizens, to fulfill their duties to God. Remember, human beings have rights because they have duties. God created man, and man was created by God to fulfill a certain service to God, to know God, to love him, and to serve him. And it is because man has those obligations to God that he has the right to fulfill those obligations and to do whatever is necessary to fulfill those obligations.
Father, why don't we move now and try to discuss several of the current issues which are alive today. For instance, freedom of the press. We have this idea that the press essentially can write anything it wants, and that any restriction on its right is viewed as censorship. What is the framework, the proper framework for the operation of the press? How much freedom can they have? What can't they do?
Well, obviously, the press cannot do anything that would be scandalous, cannot print something that is false. The press would have the same obligation that an individual would have. The press cannot commit detraction or calumny, to spread damaging information, even if it's true, if it's not necessary. The press cannot be biased. There's an interesting recent edition of the Reader's Digest, in fact, that has an article on the bias of the press, which seems to consider its role today as being the great adversary the great deliverer from the establishment, from whatever government or whatever. And this is not at all the purpose of the press. The purpose of the press is to disseminate true information, to enable people to use that information to form a right view.
Who should determine this?
Who should determine?
Who's going to determine what the press can and can't do? For instance, you said they can't print scandal. I would imagine that if there is a trial which is dealing with very sensitive issues and affects, you know, families and scandal and so on and so forth, it would seem to me that the press should not print those details and, how should I say, drag this man through the mud, even if he were no good. Who's going to determine this?
Well, those details, whatever details are necessary for the common good should be published, all right? But the press seems to wallow in lurid details, appealing to the lowest passions of men. And I think if one were to take a poll or to perform a kind of survey of people reading the newspaper, they have perhaps 15 articles or less on the front page, maybe 6 articles, and one of them is very lurid. I think the natural tendency of a person is to go to that one, read that, before they would read about a summit.
But getting back to the question, who is going to determine when the press has overstepped its bounds?
Well, obviously, those who are an authority in government, who themselves should be cognizant of the natural law of God, should have some influence over that. But the ideal thing is, just like with the guilds of the Middle Ages, those who are put in a position of responsibility should be responsible. They should be put into that position of responsibility because they have shown that they have good judgment, they are trustworthy, and their idea is not profit at any cost, but for the true benefit of society.
There's those who would argue that if you give government the power to restrict absolute freedom to the press, then you're in fact creating a system of censorship where you're going to have tyranny.
Any government of men who do not follow the law of God will be a tyranny. Now, I know in modern liberal parlance, it's just the other way around. They consider that governments that presume to follow the law of God will be tyrannies. That's not so. Any government that follows the moral law of Jesus Christ as laid out in the Gospels and taught by the Catholic Church, the traditional Catholic Church, will not be a tyranny. Now, we look back into the times of the kings, the Catholic kings, and you had good kings and you had bad kings. And the bad kings were bad kings because they considered themselves to be laws unto themselves.
So you're saying whether or not something is written down on a piece of paper has no meaning if the person has no intention to follow it.
If the person will just do whatever he thinks is expedient at the moment for his own personal welfare, that's tyranny.
What about something along the lines of pornography, for instance? This is viewed as a victimless crime, and it says that if someone wants to see pornographic literature and buy it, no one should deny him this because he's not hurting anyone. How would you respond to something like this?
Well, that's not true.
Well, it says if the government denies this, this is an act of tyranny. It's restricting his rights.
Well, it depends on what you think is the role of government. If the role of government is simply to let everyone do what he feels like, if that's what you mean by liberty, that everyone can do whatever he feels like, then sure, that would be the obligation of government. But that's not what we mean by liberty. Any government that recognizes the authority of God and the rights of God will have to realize that its obligation is to help the moral tone of the country. Now, this is nothing new. Unfortunately, nowadays, it seems outrageous. But if you go back to the message of the Founding Fathers, even the deists, even they did occasionally speak about the necessity of morality at the very foundation of this nation, and how this nation cannot exist without morality.
It seems that the supreme arbiter of what is right and wrong in the United States is the Supreme Court. For instance, in the case of abortion, they will decide whether or not one can have an abortion or one may not have an abortion. Is this a good state of affairs?
Julius, if you were reading an article about an unnamed country in which there was a board of 9 human beings who had the authority to decide, without appeal, not only whether someone was innocent or guilty, but whether someone were human or not. You would think you were reading about a country behind the Iron Curtain. But we have in this country right now a situation in which 9 human beings who have the authority, and the utter authority, the absolute authority to decide who is human and who is not. And it's purely based on a philosophical ideas based upon existentialism. If you read the Roe versus Wade decision of 1973, it's purely existential philosophy. They decided the deaths of 20 million children on the basis of private philosophy.
One question now about censorship.
By the way, that is liberalism at its best or worst.
All right.
The idea that we 9 people are God. We will decide who is human and who is not. There's no law above us. There's no higher authority.
How should they decide? What should guide the Supreme Court?
Well, unfortunately, when you get people who have philosophical ideas that are totally divorced from any revelation of Jesus Christ, and say that as Supreme Court judges, we must be completely indifferent to faith of any kind, even my personal faith, let's say. Personally, I'm opposed to abortion, but after all, when it comes to public life, I have to pretend that it's perfectly fine. Well, I mean, Julius, after all, if you were running for public office and you had to get votes by promising people that if you were elected, you would not follow your conscience, well, that would make you a kind of monster. The fact is that not too long ago, we had a president who did just that. He was accused of being a Catholic. What a terrible thing, terrible accusation. And people were afraid that he would follow his Catholic conscience if he were elected. And so he reassured everyone by telling them, I assure you, if I'm elected president, I will not act like a Catholic as president. Someone who tells you that he's not going to follow his conscience is not to be trusted with anything. What should he have done, you say? Well, he should have stood up and said, I am a Catholic. I will follow my Catholic conscience. If you want that, vote for me. If you don't vote for me.
You're saying essentially then that these legislators don't have their ultimate responsibility to the people who elected them, but in fact to God.
Exactly.
That doesn't seem to be the case in our country.
No, it doesn't seem to be the case. Unfortunately, the American system is a very beautiful system. If it could be tied to the moral law of Christ, that would be wonderful. As a matter of fact, I understand that Benjamin Franklin credited certain structures in the government of this country, in the very Constitution itself, to rules of certain Catholic religious orders of the Middle Ages, because he saw the beauty of the structure of these religious institutions.
Another issue which has been before the public, prayer in schools, specifically in public schools. The Supreme Court seems to say we cannot favor prayer in school because this favors one denomination as opposed to another. What's your reaction on that? What should be the role of prayer in schools, and God in schools, religion in schools?
Well, unfortunately, if you did have prayer in school, I'm afraid the state would want to control that too, and would organize some kind of state prayer or state religion. Certainly wouldn't be in favor of that. But I think the state, insofar as you have a secular school, which is wrong in the first place, you're going to have this problem. There's no such thing as a secular school. A school which presumes to educate in a purely secular way treats a person as though he were nothing but a collection of molecules with no soul is an abomination. An organization like that, an institution like that, cannot truly educate. Education is principally the formation of conscience. So, as long as you have a secular system of education that ignores the soul, treats a person as though he were a machine, no more than that, you're going to have this problem. I would like to see some type of Catholic religious instruction available to the Catholics in these secular institutions, if they have to be there, and to see them be able to pray as Catholics.
Very briefly, perhaps you can get back to one more point about censorship. There was a film which caused something of a stir, perhaps a year or so ago, called Hail Mary. And that was shown in many parts of the United States, and certain people said that shouldn't be shown. Others said, well, if you don't show this, this is an act of tyranny, and even though we may disagree with these people, They have the right to do it. What's the reaction to this?
Well, Catholics would find that film, Hail Mary, as offensive as a Jew who heard someone making fun of the Holocaust. Now, you know, and it's almost forbidden. I think in one country, at least, it's illegal to speak against the Holocaust.
I
That
believe
film,
that's Canada, as a matter of fact.
yes, that film was blasphemous. And it seems that Catholics have no voice anymore. One can mock the Catholic Church, one can mock Catholic institutions with impunity. Why is this? I think it's because the Catholic bishops don't do anything about it. I actually think it's because when there is mockery of the Catholic religion, it is mockery of the pre-Vatican II religion. And those in charge of the Catholic Church now like that because it sort of justifies all the changes they've made in the past 20 years. That's why I think they don't object.
What do you think of the U.S. bishops' reaction, in fact, to Hail Mary and other films which have been either offensive to Catholic morality or have been outright attacks on Catholic doctrine?
About their reaction?
Yes.
It's so weak-kneed, it's embarrassing. It's an embarrassment.
What do you think they should have done?
They should have come out, and they should have explained from the rooftops that this is blasphemy. Catholics will not tolerate this public disgrace and public offense.